It was an ordinary Tuesday morning. Classes had just begun. Girls in uniforms filed into their desks. Teachers wrote on chalkboards. The day looked like every other day. And then one girl stood up. She grabbed the edge of her desk. Her legs buckled. She dropped to the floor. Her teacher rushed over. A classmate screamed. Within minutes, 3 more girls were down, legs paralyzed, unable to move. By the end of the school day, dozens of students were being carried out on stretchers. Doctors were called. Ambulances arrived. Blood was drawn. Neurological tests were run. And the results came back with a finding that no one in that school, no parent, no teacher, no student, was prepared to accept. There was nothing physically wrong with any of them. Not a virus. Not a toxin. Not a neurological disease. The paralysis was real. The pain was real. The inability to walk was real. But medicine had no physical explanation for any of it.
The cases. What I'm about to describe isn't a single event. It is a pattern, one that has repeated itself across continents, across centuries, in schools, factories, convents, and villages. And the more you look at the documented cases, the harder they are to dismiss. Let's start with one of the most scientifically studied, the Democratic Republic of Congo, between 1994 and 1998. In a small school district in the
Now travel back a decade earlier and further north to the occupied West Bank. March 21st, 1983. A classroom in Araba, a village in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. A girl jumps up from her desk at 8 o'clock in the morning, runs to the window, choking and sobbing in pain. Within minutes, other students are on the floor, experiencing dizziness, headaches, blurred vision, abdominal pain, fainting. The symptoms spread, not just in one school. Within days, they had spread to other schools across multiple towns. Within 2 weeks, 943 people had been hospitalized, the overwhelming majority of them teenage girls. And here is where this case becomes something far more explosive than a medical mystery. Because it didn't stay in the hospitals. It went to the United Nations. When mass hysteria became an international incident. On March 31st, 1983, just 10 days after the first girl collapsed, the permanent representative to the United Nations from Iraq formally addressed the Security Council, calling for an investigation into what he described as mass poisoning of Palestinian schoolgirls by Israeli forces. The Security Council convened. The Secretary General was asked to conduct an independent investigation. The Red Cross got involved. The World Health Organization sent investigators. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services followed. Palestinian leaders accused Israel of using chemical weapons to drive Arab populations from the West Bank. Israeli military officials, in their own contradictory response, accused Palestinian political factions of deliberately poisoning their own people to incite an uprising. People were arrested. The entire situation was on the edge of sparking armed conflict. And the whole time, every investigator from every institution, including Israel's own lead psychiatric investigator, Dr. Albert Hifez, was reaching the same quiet, explosive conclusion. There had likely never been any poison gas at all. The UN investigation found mass hysteria to be the likeliest cause. The Red Cross concluded the same. The World Health Organization concurred. A Palestinian health official acknowledged that while roughly 20% of early cases may have involved exposure to some mild environmental irritant, the remaining 80% were psychosomatic. Dr. Hafiz published a landmark study in 1985 documenting exactly how the outbreak had been amplified. A front-page article in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on March 28th had claimed Israeli investigators found traces of nerve gas. That single headline, published before any conclusion was reached, ignited a chain reaction of fear. Arab medical personnel concluded the poison must be coming from Israel. Israeli officials concluded Palestinians were manufacturing the incident for political gain. By the time the truth was established, the damage was done. A mass psychogenic illness had, for 2 weeks, brought two populations to the brink of violence, not because of any weapon, but because of a phenomenon science still struggles to fully explain. The science, what is actually happening? So, what is actually happening when dozens of healthy teenagers suddenly cannot walk? The clinical term is mass psychogenic illness, MPI for short. It was previously called mass hysteria, a term that has largely fallen out of favor because of its dismissive, gendered history. But whatever we call it, the mechanism is both well documented and deeply mysterious. Here is what researchers know. MPI almost always begins with a single index case. One person who becomes genuinely ill or who experiences a powerful stress response. That person collapses, convulses, or develops sudden symptoms in full view of others. And then something extraordinary happens. The human brain, particularly the adolescent brain, activates what neurologists believe may be an overactive mirror neuron system. Mirror neurons are the cells responsible for empathy and social imitation. They fire when you watch someone else perform an action, almost as if you were performing it yourself. They are the reason you flinch when you see someone get hurt. In MPI, researchers theorize that mirror neurons fire so intensely in response to seeing a peer collapse, especially in a high-stress environment, that the brain begins generating genuine physical symptoms, not imaginary ones. Genuine paralysis, genuine blindness, genuine seizures. A peer-reviewed study documented that when MPI patients' brains were scanned during episodes, the paralysis registered in brain imaging exactly like neurological paralysis caused by physical injury. The brain had generated the symptom as thoroughly as any disease could. There are consistent patterns across every documented outbreak. MPI spreads by sight and by sound. You need to see or hear about a case to be at risk of developing it. It appears most commonly in closed social groups, schools, factories, religious communities. It disproportionately affects adolescent girls, a demographic that experiences some of the highest rates of social stress and social bonding simultaneously. The symptoms spread rapidly, then resolve almost completely once affected individuals are separated, taken home, removed from the building, taken out of the social environment where the contagion began. That pattern, rapid onset, clustering by social exposure, resolution upon separation, no physical cause found, is the signature of MPI in every case on record. The darker question. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because every time MPI is diagnosed, whether in the Congo, the West Bank, upstate New York, or rural Kenya, the same thing happens. The patients are told the illness is in their head, and they almost universally refuse to accept it. In a 2012 outbreak in Leroy, New York, where a group of teenage girls at a high school developed sudden tics, involuntary movements, and speech disorders. The New York State Department of Health investigated. The CDC investigated. Columbia University investigated. The school was tested for mold, lead, carbon monoxide, and dozens of other environmental contaminants. All results were negative. When neurologists announced the diagnosis, mass psychogenic illness, parents were furious. Environmental activist Erin Brockovich launched her own independent investigation. Families rejected the finding publicly on national television. One father said, "Obviously, all of us are not accepting that this is just a stress thing, and our kids didn't all get sick by coincidence." And here is the thing that makes this so genuinely difficult. He wasn't wrong to push back. Because the history of medicine includes cases where symptoms dismissed as hysteria turned out to have real physical causes. A 1990 outbreak in a British school, initially attributed to mass hysteria, was later partially explained by pesticide contamination of cucumbers served at lunch. The line between "no physical cause found yet" and "no physical cause exists" is not always as clear as investigators present it. There is also the question of who gets this diagnosis and who doesn't. Across the documented record, MPI disproportionately affects adolescent girls, women in high-stress workplaces, and communities under significant political or social pressure. When the condition appeared in Salem in 1692, they called it witchcraft. When it appeared in Victorian England, they called it female hysteria. When it appears today, we call it conversion disorder. The label changes, but the pattern is always the same. The people most affected are those whose stress is least acknowledged, whose distress is least validated, and whose bodies are most likely to be treated as unreliable witnesses to their own experience. The close. The girls in the Congo who lost the ability to walk eventually recovered. Most MPI episodes resolve completely. The symptoms disappear as mysteriously as they arrived. The 943 people hospitalized in the West Bank in 1983 recovered. The political firestorm they inadvertently sparked took longer to subside. The teenagers in Leroy, New York recovered. Some took months. Some took longer. Most have moved on. But the question that none of these cases fully answers is this. If the mind is capable of generating complete, verified paralysis without any physical injury, what does that tell us about the relationship between the brain and the body? What does it tell us about the limits of what we think we know about human illness? And what does it tell us about the specific, particular, documented pressure that falls on adolescent girls, in schools, in conflict zones, in tightly wound social environments? That their bodies seem to express in ways their words are not permitted to? The paralysis was never in their heads. It was in their brains. And there is a difference, one that medicine is still, decades later, learning how to make. The close. The girls in the Congo who lost the ability to walk eventually recovered. Most MPI episodes resolve completely. The symptoms disappear as mysteriously as they arrived. The 943 people hospitalized in the West Bank in 1983 recovered. The political firestorm they inadvertently sparked took longer to subside. The teenagers in Leroy, New York recovered. Some took months. Some took longer. Most have moved on. But the question that none of these cases fully answers is this. If the mind is capable of generating complete, verified paralysis without any physical injury, what does that tell us about the relationship between the brain and the body? What does it tell us about the limits of what we think we know about human illness? And what does it tell us about the specific, particular, documented pressure that falls on adolescent girls, in schools, in conflict zones, in tightly wound social environments? That their bodies seem to express in ways their words are not permitted to? The paralysis was never in their heads. It was in their brains. And there is a difference, one that medicine is still, decades later, learning how to make.